Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining Stronger Roots. Today we have a very special guest, Linda. And how do you say your last name?
Viti.
Beatty. Okay. Linda, I found on TikTok, I came across her information. She was having a lot of great informative videos that really hit home with me. And she shares so much of herself on TikTok. And we wanted to have her come on this podcast. And Beth, can you tell us a little bit more about
Sure,
Linda?
I can. Linda was born into trauma, experienced it at a very young age, and struggled with many of the unhealthy coping mechanisms trauma victims do. She got into counseling, like many, to understand herself and her family. And in doing that, she started to understand intergenerational trauma. And in graduate school, her repressed memories came to light. Since then, she has been on a mission to help others with trauma. She graduated from Cairn University with an MS in counseling in 2003, as well as attending the College of New Jersey's Graduate School in Counseling. She worked as a therapist for Randall B. Hicks and Associates, and in 2005, while there, she launched Complete Life Coaching, now Linda Vita's Life and Coaching and Counseling. Linda has a deep desire to turn her own pain into purpose. She recognized the importance of studying intergenerational trauma and hoped to teach others how to break this destructive cycle in order to find recovery. There is hope for healing for each survivor, as well as protection for next generation. This hope is what steered Linda toward trauma-informed therapy and support. She has been there herself. She can relate effectively to those who are struggling with all forms of trauma, injuries, and coping mechanisms. Linda did a year of postgraduate internship with group counseling. She saw how effective it was and what the extra dynamic of group work can do for those struggling with these issues. She started a group therapy for trauma recovery that is available and free to all of her clients. Look for the Triumphant Trauma Tribe on Facebook. And for more information, we're going to go to Linda. Thanks for being here today. We're so happy you're
Thanks for
here.
having me.
What a impressive background that you have, Linda. And I love what your bio said about turning your pain into purpose. And can you tell us about what inspired you to become a coach and a counselor and doing what you do?
Well, like many counselors, when you grow up in this, it's very you're trying to figure out why things are the way that you are, why things are the way they are, why you do the things you do, why your family is the way it is. And I know from a young age, I was actually helping my mother regulate her emotions and counsel her when family dynamics happened because she never dealt with her own trauma. So as I grew up, that became a very important thing I wanted to do. I wanted to figure myself out, number one, and my family out, but I also wanted to help other people. It was like a passion I've had since I was young.
Oh, that's wonderful. So you shared that you grew up in this narcissistic type dynamic in a family system. How do you think that those experiences shaped you to be the person that you are?
Well, my father was an overt narcissist. My mother was an enabling um, person who never went dealt with her trauma. And my brother was the golden child. I was the scapegoat, like many of the families I counsel. And what that does to a child is they believe everything's their fault. And they grow up believing that all the problems in the family are because of them. And at a very young age, I became an identified patient. I started an eating disorder at 10 after being sexually molested by my dad. And they put me in therapy, but as soon as they went to family therapy, they walked out and said, no, we're not the issue. She's the issue. And so I became the identified patient. And that's how I coped. I had an eating disorder. And then as a teenager, I drank to cover up the eating disorder. And so when I started understanding as a young adult that these weren't serving me, that became my quest to figure out what was going to be different. And what I didn't know then that I know now is that we gravitate towards what is familiar, not towards what's healthy, towards what's familiar. So the butterflies we feel, oh, it's chemistry, it's chemistry. No, it's not. It's familiarity. And that's how people get the intergenerational trauma and get back into these and recreate them to make their childhood turn out differently than it did. And it never works.
Hmm. So you mentioned that your dad was a overt narcissist,
Correct.
and then I've also heard the term covert narcissist. So can you explain the difference between those two?
Yes, they're very similar, and the DSM only has NPD. They don't have the different categories like we talk about. It only has NPD. So as a therapist, I knew nothing about covert narcissism. Overt narcissism you can kind of pick out. It's the grandiosity, they're very charismatic, they how wonderful they are, they're bragging a lot, they do a lot of control and domination. With covert, it's a little bit different because they use passive aggressiveness. They still use the gaslighting and all the other things like projection, manipulation, but it's very under the wire. So they will present like the knight in shining armor or the perfect lady because men and women both struggle with this. And those are the ones that I focus on the most because they're the hardest to pick out and they're the most insidious.
Mhm. Yeah. How does traits like manipulation, triangulation, projection show up in domestic violence and then also in sexual abuse too?
Well, sexual abuse is actually part of domestic violence many times.
Mhm.
Um, Things like coercive control, marital rape, all kinds of things show up in domestic violence. But manipulation is how they get you into the place, especially grooming when it's younger people. Grooming is part of their manipulation. Love bombing is part of the manipulation, and that is done in all of these relationships are built on deception. They know exactly what they're doing going into it, and it's completely built on deception. And then they will do things like what was the second word you used? Manipulation, triangulation,
Projection.
projection.
Yeah.
Triangulation they use to get other people involved. They'll do things like, well, so and so would not do that, but you do that, or so and so said they think you're emotionally unstable, which happens a lot in these relationships. And so you start looking inward and you're isolated. And then when um, I'm sorry, what's the last word?
The projection.
The projection.
Uh-huh.
And the projection, what happens is the best defense is a good offense. So what they do is they go on the offense and they'll say things like, "You're cheating on me." And the person will like, "No, I'm not cheating." And they're looking through everything. "Look, I'm showing you all my proof." Well, they're cheating and they're just projecting it onto the other person. Or they will say things like, "You're not treating me well." Well, they're actually the ones not treating them well. So the empathetic damaged person looks inside and starts.
And it's all chipping away at that self-esteem, right?
That's
Chipping away at the
5,000 times.
self-esteem, chipping away at the confidence, trying to put you to, and we see this across all lines of things, even like into trafficking and things. And that's coming up to that is like, then the big old question, well, if this is what was going on, why did you stay? Why
Mhm.
did you? Oh my gosh, I cannot stand that phrase. It's like,
Right.
well, why did you stay if it was that bad? What?
The trauma bond, the
Yes.
intermittent reinforcement that they do with the manipulation, the projection, the triangulation, the gaslighting is one minute you're the best thing since sliced bread, the next minute you're you have all these issues that they have a problem with. And so you're always trying to get back to the love bombing and that person they were at the beginning, which was an illusion. It doesn't exist. And they build into the deception that that's who they really are. That person at the beginning is who they really are. And they had a bad day at work, so they had to do this. They're now tired, so they had to do this. So you spend years just believing that you're trying to get back to that person. So you're working overtime while they're chipping away at your self-esteem and doing all kinds of stuff secretly.
Yeah. And then when you have children in that mix and the children are growing up in that, we talked earlier today about that's the kids see that and that's normal to them.
And
That's
that's the
just, and they don't understand what the difference is. So then once you get up to a place where then, okay, maybe this relationship ends and then it's then kind of getting those kids on one side versus the other. They
And
don't
that's
understand.
and nature and nurture with that as well, because kids can have a predisposition just like alcoholism or heart disease or
Sure.
anything else. And when they're modeled it, then they may pick up the tendencies and the traits. So you can never predict which way a child's going to go. I mean, there's some little inklings, but we never diagnose young.
Yeah.
And so after puberty, you can kind of tell, are they going, more on the tendency side, or are they more of a damaged empath? And one of the things that people don't realize I have a lot of folks that are getting out of these relationships later in life when the kids are already adults and move out. So they stayed for the kids, they protected the narcissistic person, and then they get out and the child aligns with the narcissist. And they're like, how the heck did this happen? It's because, especially coverts, will subtly behind your back when you're not looking send messages and give messages like, oh, mom's emotionally unstable, or dad's, got an issue with not talking, or, they're subtly making the safe parent the problem. And all the child sees is your reaction, because many times coverts do not target the children, they only target the spouse.
Yeah.
So if they're not targeting the children say, I didn't see it growing up, you're the problem.
Right. Yeah. That's very interesting. Yeah. Um, there was a question I was going to ask, and it just kind of, as soon as you said that, I was like, just slipped my mind. But triangulation, how does that look like in these relationship dynamics where, dad or mom, has been the safe parent, and then you have a covert narcissist who, has been triangulating the kids all along. I mean, that's so hard to accept, isn't it? It's just, and it's so hard for when, how do you get the kids to see that? Or do they just come to it on their own? What's the best
Not
way to-
um a lot of times triangulation happens with, like, in my case, my ex-husband would whisper in my ear, your son's doing this, your son's doing that. And then I would go confront him. We would get into a fight about it, and then they would come in and play mediator and act like the hero.
Gotcha.
Um, and they leave the negative stuff to you to do, and they're just the good guy. And so the child sees and a lot of times they get you to react emotionally, or reactive abuse, we call it. I like to call it protective reaction. I think that's a better term. But when we get into that and the child sees we're reacting, but the covert stays calm and relaxed and, got it all together. But a lot of times, if they're especially higher on the spectrum, it's really because they got some sociopathy where they don't feel anything about anything, so they don't react.
Yeah. So then when you are in a court situation, then it looks more like she or he or whatever is the crazy one. They're the
Exactly.
emotional one. They're the one over here complaining about this. It's like, and then how do we help, like, the family courts to understand that the person that's being in this model is really actually the abuser, and start really paying attention, because in court it's like, it's all, well, you can't prove it, or it's high conflict, or it gets all of these different words and labels, when really you have someone who is so broken and so beaten down
And traumatized.
and traumatized. And I like talk about a little bit, if you can, about the trauma part of that, because I've done a lot of work in trauma and worked with a lot of folks in trauma, and people hear that, and I don't think they understand how the trauma early on affects the development, and how that works, because you have a child who's gone through this, and then maybe something happened and before they were 10, and then that trauma goes untreated. By the time they get into being a teenager and in high school or middle school or whatever, and then they start getting maybe introduced to substances like pot or alcohol or something, and then they start self medicating to feel better, because this feeling here was ugh, and they don't understand what it is. And then maybe we have somebody in addiction, and how that trauma starts to lead. Not that everybody who has trauma falls into addiction, because we know that's not true, but it does happen.
Yeah,
And
happens a lot.
yeah, and so can you speak to a little bit about like what you've seen in your work and that trauma when it's left untreated.
The first thing the first thing that happens, children make everything their fault to keep their world safe. So if the adult is doing something or something's happening with the adult, the child's going to make it their fault because they can change themselves. They can't change the adult. So that's why they naturally go to it's my fault. And when they do that, and the parent, it really, if the parents are part of the trauma, they feel completely alone in what they're doing. I know for me, it started at 6, and then when I was being molested, and I would tell my mom, it's like, oh, you're making that up. That's not really happening. Don't you dreamt it's not real, or they make you out to be the problem. You realize that nothing's safe, and when you internalize that, you're trying to figure it out yourself as a kid. But many times kids will do things like act out. You'll see different behaviors like bedwetting after they've already you know been potty trained. You'll see acting out behaviors. You'll see them shut down and be withdrawn. And what happens is they're growing, is that trauma is built into their nervous system. So they're triggered by things. And this is why we see things like cutting, eating disorders. That's about controlling the pain because they don't know what to do with their pain. And so as they grow up and they go through puberty, then they're trying to figure this all out on their own. And if that's why early intervention, I can't say enough about early intervention, because that is the number one thing I see is trauma is swept under the rug and it's not dealt with because it's stored in the body and the brain and the memory. And many times, like mine was, you repress those memories. And so you're acting out of things that you don't even understand. Like I knew something happened, but your memories are blank. So the first question I'll ask in counseling is, do you have clear memories of your childhood? And if somebody says, no, I don't remember below 9, there was trauma there. So many times the trauma is actually repressed, and then the child just starts having this symptomology that they don't know what to do with. And we get to things, ways to cope that are negative.
Yeah.
And they don't even always understand why they're doing it.
True, which makes sense then. I mean, I felt like it would make sense that part of maybe this process, I've talked to a lot of people that have said, well, I wanted my child to go to counseling, but the other parent wouldn't let them go. If I've heard that once, I've heard that so many times over the last several years. And it's like, we all know why the one parent doesn't want the other child.
They're afraid.
I mean, everybody knows that's like the most blatant neon sign flashing,
Right.
But then how do we get help for that child? How do we, without, even with a court order? I mean, it's so, and I'll give an example of like a lot of the cases that I've worked on in the past. I feel like that when these children come into care, that counseling should be part of that.
Absolutely.
That's already a traumatic thing. So when you're in this other situation, and these kids are going through that, it just, counseling should be part of that. Even if the child doesn't think they need to talk, they still need to be in front of a trauma therapist to help guide them. I mean, what are your thoughts on that in the work that you do?
I absolutely think it's absolutely crucial, especially in narcissistic family systems, because they don't want anything getting outside the family. So if they're going through a court case, the narcissistic parent is not. I've been fired from cases where I, kind of got in there and dealt with what was happening, and they don't want anything to do with it. They want the control and the power. But it has to be mandated, and it can't be one parent is allowed to say no. It's that's got to go. Yeah. Because it should be the child's best interest, not the parent's best interest. And I think that's a big part of the problem. Like you said, if one parent doesn't want them to go, they can't go, correct?
Yeah. In a lot of cases, yeah, a lot of cases that I've seen. Yeah, because then it's like then that's further manipulation, and it's like our point here is to never bash family court attorneys. That's no. Not our role. It's not what we're trying to do, but it's trying to help bring that awareness that okay, yeah, maybe this is something that needs to happen. Maybe there is a reason for this, because at the end of the day, the kids are the one that faces gets all of the brunt of this.
Yeah, and they're not giving, I really believe that the bar is so high in some of these narcissistic abuse cases. And I'm just going to say that because all domestic violence and sexual abuse falls under the people on the narcissistic spectrum are the ones who commit it. So when we have that in the court case, and they're not doing psychological background checks, they're not looking at different tools that could expose it, then they're going by their subjective gut or the lawyer or the judge's feeling about it or experience. And a lot of times abusers end up with the kids and the safe parent is cut out, or the abuser is given 50-50 custody when they've not even been involved or been doing damage to the child, because there is no necessaries. And the bar, they they said that you have to get a psychologist, psychiatrist, get them tested, get them diagnosed, and then you can bring it into court. Well, no one, most people that are going through this don't have the finances to do that. So the family court just makes a decision based on whatever evidence is presented. And many times people are so traumatized, they don't keep good documentation or good records because they're not thinking clearly. They're living in fight or flight all the time. And so they have a real disadvantage. And I think we've got to make a thing across the board where if it's a custody thing and you're not sure if there's abuse on either side, there should be psychological evaluations, period.
Mhm.
And there's not, right? Correct? And I
That's
don't
true.
do a lot with the court, but
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that falls into a lot of roles for a lot of people, is that psychological evaluation is so key. But then I've also seen where people have come through okay on those too, and they really weren't.
and that's the thing. Sociopaths and really higher on the spectrum folks can kind of fake the system, but there are some that actually catch it. They ask the same question 4 different ways, and a lot of times they can catch those type of individuals. But I think there's got to be much more done with custody cases, because I have seen such a disservice to children in how they are left in the hands of their abuser, especially with sexual abuse. A lot of times, unless you have physical proof or something, or the child will admit it, and the child's afraid of the abusive parent, so they're not going to admit abuse. I had a case where I had absolute videotape of emotional abuse, but I believe there was much more going on. And they said, well, the kid said it didn't happen, so there's nothing we can do. And they
Oh, I've seen that so many times. It's so frustrating. So frustrating, and they'll go to a place where they have to talk about that with a therapist at a place that's acceptable to law enforcement and everything else. And then the child may not disclose, or even if they disclose a little bit and they do look into it, when you're dealing with younger kids, they don't make that stuff up. But it's hard then to get them. I get that it's hard to build a case and things off of that. I've had a lot of cases that we've had to deal with that on, but it's just, I feel like there's just much, so much room for change and education and trauma. I mean, even trauma training. It's like, talk a little bit
trauma.
about, like, because you have a big background in trauma and training and stuff. How detrimental is it for, like, foster parents and attorneys and judges and people who are in positions of decision making authority to not fully understand trauma and be able to recognize the patterns of that?
Well, I think a lot of them aren't familiar with not only trauma, but domestic violence issues. And a lot of time, the domestic violence victim is covering for the perpetrator, and the perpetrator is blaming the domestic violence victim. I mean, the Gabby Petito story was a great example of how sometimes law enforcement and judges and lawyers don't see this clearly. And we need more training in that, but we also need them to really look into these cases more. Sometimes they don't even look at the paperwork. I've had cases where they've had paperwork and proof, and judges are like, we don't have time to look at this. This is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm seeing. And it's devastating to the cases because they don't go into detail and look at all the evidence or all the trauma. And education, I think, is key in the court cases. And we need more people like you, more advocates. I think somebody who's been traumatized should walk in with an advocate, because many of them ask me to go with them because they freeze. You saw me at the beginning. Like, I have CPTSD myself. So when you asked that one question, I couldn't remember. When I'm a little nervous and those symptoms click in, you can't think clearly
True.
until you relax, until you take a little bit of time and just calm yourself down, which I've learned to do, as you can see. But those are things that happen in court, and then they don't get their point across, or they don't get the words out. And they give extra time now to somebody with PTSD or CPTSD in courts. They're supposed to, but not all courts acknowledge it because of that reason.
I had a question, Linda, too, about we associate so much of domestic violence being physical violence, like bruises and, black eyes, and I worked in the domestic violence field for a very long time, and that's kind of, this was 20 something years ago, and it was about physical bruises and maybe there was some financial type stuff going on, but domestic violence is a lot of different things. And so, we're talking, the physical things, yes, of course, but can you kind of talk about what domestic violence encompasses? Like what all different, things that we're talking about, like,
It encompasses emotional abuse, verbal abuse, coercive control. A lot of times, especially with covert cases, the person is actually literally trying to drive the other person insane, make them believe the reality is not true by gaslighting, making them like sometimes mine would take things, move things, and then go, "Did you lose that again?" And try to help me find it, and then find it and go, "You are so careless. There's something really wrong with you." And they're literally trying to make you feel like there's something wrong with you. And then they'll say things like, "Oh, you're gonna wear your hair like that? You're gonna," like little tiny things, but they're one on top of another, on top of another, on top of another. And when you go to approach anything or resolve anything, they blow up at you. It's, you can't bring anything up, you can't do anything. So you're so busy trying to make them happy that you lose yourself, and you start they present with anxiety, depression. Many of them develop PTSD or CPTSD. um, but the emotional abuse that they get the person to actually believe they are the problem when they're being systematically abused verbally or emotionally. And a lot of the times it's neglect and ignoring and the silent treatment that really throws people over the edge, because you're living with the person who's supposed to be your partner, and they walk in the door and they go right by you and pretend you're not alive and hug the dog, really telling you you don't matter. And all these little tiny things that people think, ah, that happens in every marriage. Because when you explain this to the outside world, they go, that happens in every marriage. It's not a big deal. But we're talking on a daily basis, being ignored or never having your needs met or never being able to resolve an issue or say your feelings because they don't want to talk about feelings or emotional abuse. And then when we get into intimacy, they don't want any emotional intimacy. So many times in covert cases, they will pull back even physically. It's either they use them as a just a physical person with no emotional intimacy, or they withdraw completely and they're doing what I see as pornography and cheating. Almost all of my cases have one or the other. And then they're blamed, "Oh, well, I had to cheat because you don't do this, or you're not attractive enough anymore," or whatever it is. And so even in that, they're making them the problem. And when they tell lies and then you call the lie out, they make that even the problem. "Well, I had to lie because you're this and you're that." And so you're so beaten down, you don't even know which way is up. And confusion is the number one tool of a narcissistic person. Number one tool.
So, do you think, in your opinion or in your expertise, do you think narcissistic people are made, or do you think that it's a characteristic type thing, or, because I've heard that, oftentimes narcissists are made because of a childhood trauma, or they were like the golden child or something like that. What is, what's the research say about, how these people come to be, and what to look for, with this type of pathology?
Right. It's nature and nurture. So they may be predisposed, but if they're never exposed to narcissism, they're not going to develop it. And so if they are predisposed and they grow up in a narcissistic household, they're going to be modeled it. And that's how they pick it up. But childhood trauma can happen because let's say I have cases where the narcissistic parent is abusing the child and the child gets to puberty and says, can't beat him. I might as well join him. And they start beating up on their younger siblings and mimicking the behavior, or they do it at school or somewhere. And a lot of times, some of my cases are homeschooled because they don't want the kids going to school and having problems in school. And usually we don't want to diagnose this early, but after puberty you can start seeing the tendencies and which way they're going to go with it. But a lot of times narcissists will use childhood trauma. Oh, well, my bad behavior is because of childhood trauma. I don't care. Look, I've had severe trauma. I don't go around hurting other people. It's not an excuse to go around hurting other people, but they use that to lure empaths in, and they want to fix them. They want to make them better. You can't make these folks better unless they actually have some kind of a narcissistic breakdown or collapse where they like they're broken about something. And it's rare. It's extremely, extremely rare. And even folks that have been in counseling for long periods of time can sometimes get worse because they just learn how to use the buzzwords and manipulate the therapist. Um,
What
so
about, real quick, what about going, a lot of couples will try couples therapy, right? To, help their marriage or whatever, and is that an opportunity for the narcissist to learn more about the victim in order to wound them more? I mean, I would think that that's just a recipe for disaster to go into counseling where you have to be vulnerable, with someone, and you're working on your problems and all that kind of stuff, but they have the intention of using what you say in counseling to wound you. I mean, that's just really
I
tough.
have two no-nos in narcissistic abuse from my experience, and that is you never call a narcissist, and you never go to couples counseling with them. Because just as that was one of my biggest cases that kind of blew the lid wide open on my research, is that when they get in couples counseling, they will do things like dog whistling, which is where they'll tell something that only the survivor knows about, and they'll have a huge reaction. You're like, why are you overreacting to this? The counselor say, and they don't understand why. And then whatever comes out in couples counseling, when they go home, they beat the other person up with that, or they use it in a divorce proceeding. So I have not had a narcissistic case where anything good came out of couples counseling. And when I saw somebody getting beat up with it in court, I said, absolutely, I am no couples counseling. They need to go to individual counseling and work on being able to consistently change by themselves first. And then if a therapist says, okay, they've really made a difference, then possibly. But even then, I'm apprehensive, but absolutely not. I think it's detrimental.
Yeah, so if, I mean, how do you even know that? So you pretend that you don't know that your partner's a narcissist or anything like that, and you're going into couples counseling, hey, we're having some problems with this, whatever. I mean, is there something that cues you as a counselor in that, uh-oh, I'm dealing with, someone who is weaponizing some things, or, is there like a red flag moment that you have as a counselor that kind of makes you stand up a little bit straighter and kind of tune into this couple,
One of the things is family history. So if they have a child or a parent that has narcissistic abuse or tendencies, that to me is a clue, right? That's the first one. Second one is if they're trying to say things like, some of the coverts will like try to get me aside privately and say, hey, I really don't want to talk about my spouse, but you really need to know this about them. And then they're telling you something negative that the other person does, and they're keeping it hush hush. In counseling, they'll tend to tell stories when you ask them about their feelings. So instead of say, well, how do you feel about this? And they'll say, well, let me tell you this story. And they'll tell a story because they can't tap into feelings very well. So those are three big ones. And a lot of times, if I see the other person having over the top reactions and I'm not understanding why, that to me is a clue right away that it's possibly a covert case. But I put a lot of different little pieces together. And I don't think a lot of counselors are trained in this because I was not taught this in graduate school. Everything I know, I learned from either going through it or researching
Yeah.
other factors.
Yeah, I was going to say all of this, I would say in the last probably 5 to 10 years
Yes.
has done a
COVID.
tremendous shift, and we're all starting to learn about, manipulation, gaslighting. I mean, gaslighting, I didn't even know that term 20 years ago when I was working in domestic violence. Like that wasn't a term that we used. And now it's like, oh yeah, that person gaslit you or whatever. And so now you have a good understanding of what that means. And so I think that what you're doing in your personal life, and you're putting these videos together for, the, people to consume and stuff like that, is so important. And I feel like media is playing such an amazing role in trying to get the word out there. I mean, as bad as sometimes we kind of like talk about how bad social media is and how damaging it is, it's also bridging the gap, and it's connecting people in ways that maybe it never did before. And so your videos are completely educational, and it's great, what you're doing. And I really, have to say kudos to you for being a pioneer in all of that, and putting yourself out there in that way, really appreciate that. So I want to switch gears a little bit about like the healing part of things. So what do you think that a new survivor, how do you reclaim your voice? How do you step into your power after you've been through a very narcissistic relationship, or say you're going through parental alienation? How do you start to reclaim your voice back to where you feel whole again, I guess, is a good way to put it.
And the first thing that I've found is survivors need to validate you need to validate their experience. And a lot of times they will tell me counselors don't understand, or they want more information, or they're trying to give them relationship tools that absolutely do not work with narcissistic cases. So number one is validating them. Then if they're in it, you've got to get them to disengage from what the narcissist is doing and turn their attention to themselves and self care and building themselves back up, and use non reactivity. People say, is that gray rocking? Not exactly. It's similar, but no emotion, negative or positive, just the facts. And you observe what they're doing, why they're doing it. Why are they doing that now? What's the purpose? Because everything with narcissism is purposeful and transactional. So if they're doing something, there's a reason they're doing it. And when you start getting, that was a aha moment for me when I was separated, living in the same house with my exes. When you're triggered, like we said earlier, you can't think straight or you can't remember things. So if you can get your nervous system down, that's what I teach people, techniques to bring their nervous system down. And then just start observing, like be a third party observer, almost take yourself out of it for a moment, like outside your body almost, and start observing what they're doing. And you realize it's not that, it's pretty basic, universal stuff they all do. And once you start observing and say, hey, wait a minute, and then you just don't feed into it or you just don't react to it, that's a way to get your voice and your power back. And that and the self-care and focusing on you, because many times I'm sure you've seen this, they focus on their partner. What are they doing? How do I make it better? What, how can I fix them? How can, how can I make things work? And you can't.
Mhm.
You really can't.
What I'm finding is, as we're talking to people who have gone through narcissistic relationships and things like that, that there seems to be a specific kind of playbook. Like they're all kind of, cut from the same cloth, so to speak. Like
Right.
it seems like they use the same tactics in a lot of things. And you'll be talking to somebody and they'll say something like this, he did this and this and this, and then you'll, hear someone else speak about, well, he did this and this, and they're like, oh my gosh, yes, he did that to me too. So it's all like they truly are kind of like a cookie cutter, with some
Right.
extra little, razzle dazzle there that they add, but it's basically kind of the same thing. And why is that, do you think? It's just
I think it's partly wiring, brain and wiring, and a lot of times we'll see things like eye dilation, which is a sign of the wiring. And actually, we'll see it in kids that get very upset and angry that are predisposed. Never diagnose a child. We never diagnose a child, but the wiring, I think, is part of that reasoning, why they do the way they do. And they've done brain studies where there's a little bit of difference in certain areas of the brain, especially the emotive parts, like empathy. And so I think that's a big part of it.
I think what's so wild too, also, is the fact that they can mirror empathy. Like that to me,
Intellectual empathy. Yeah.
yeah, like intellectual empathy and true empathy. I mean, you feel, my goodness, if you see somebody hurting, your natural tendency is to want to go over and fix it and love on that person. And, you have a warmth, a connection there. But they are so good at just mirroring empathy. What does it look like? Can I fake through it? And that's why I think sometimes you self-doubt yourself in experiences because you think, well, they have empathy. They feel for this person, or I've seen them, in the work that they do and they care about these, the situation or whatever. So it's that's where that self-doubt, I think, kind of comes into relationships because you often think that they do have empathy when really they've been studying and doing this their whole life and they don't have empathy because someone in those situations are not going to be hurtful or try to damage someone. I mean, you want to try to, you know, be a good person in life, you don't want to go around hurting other people. And I think that's a hard pill to swallow, that not everyone has that same kind of nature, you know.
Well, communal narcissists, which are covert, are masters at this. Is they do everything for everybody else in the outside world, and they're wonderful, they're kind, they're humble. But at home, they are torturing or abusing their spouse by using their vulnerabilities that they got in the love bombing phase. They're targeting, they weaponize their trauma. They weaponize an empath's trauma, and when like you said, they doubt themselves. So they're going, well, wait, they're nice to everybody else. Maybe I'm just too sensitive, like they say, or maybe I'm too emotional, like they say. And what they do, even with animals, I've seen this where they get upset about an animal. Well, they're upset about what the animal does for them. Everything's about what you do for them. People say, do they love me? They love what you do for them, they love how you treat them. But loving that and putting your life down for that other person or thing, no, they 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 could care less, honestly, at the end of the day.
Yeah. So what type of people do these narcissists go after? Is there a certain type of person that the narcissists are attracted to? And
Yes.
you've used the word empathic and stuff like that. Is there any other signs, like besides an empathic type person? Is there like a makeup for those type of people?
Well, they are predator. predatory in nature. So they're going to look for body language. They're going to look for eye contact. They're going to look for somebody who apologizes for everything. So that's kind of a damaged empath where they've had trauma. And so when someone's had trauma, they know they can weaponize their trauma. They can get them to apologize for things they did. They can get them to meet their needs. And if they're very giving and loving to other people, so they target what they want and what they don't have. And then they praise you for that in the love bombing phase. And then once you get solidified, they start devaluing you for it.
Mm.
So it really, people say, do I have a target on my back because I keep attracting narcissists? No, you're an empathetic person, and maybe body language or the way you carry yourself or the way you talk clues them into you be easily manipulated or easily kind of feel sorry for them, so to speak.
Really targeting a vulnerable person, which is a lot of
Exactly.
what we train in human trafficking. Is the person that they're looking for is someone that's easy to coerce, easy to get right into a relationship, and just being very vulnerable.
A perfect example is my first church that I counseled at. A deacon that was there, he was a very wealthy man, and he seemed very nice. He was targeting my clients. He actually molested one of them, and he had an affair with another one. And I uncovered it, called him out, got him kicked out of the church. He went down the street to the next church, donated money there. I called the church, and they said, well, he hasn't done it here. And so these are the things they hide in plain sight in the church and in support groups and in places where vulnerable people are because it's easy to get victims there.
I was going to say there, I read this book and it was called The Gift of Fear. And I don't know if you've ever read it, but it was
Mm-mm.
life-changing for me. It's by Gavin, oh, who is it? I was just trying to find it. Um, Gavin DeBecker. And one thing that he was talking about that it just kind of sparked when you said something, but he was talking about in order to find vulnerable people, um, that a sign that a predator does is they'll, walk down the street, everybody walks down the street, and the predator will bump into somebody. And if that person turns around and says, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I was walking, I was not even paying attention, I was on my phone." And that predator will know that that is someone who is vulnerable and will say, "I'm sorry," even though it wasn't their fault that they bumped into somebody. And I think that that's what separates us, right? That's the targeted person versus the psychopath or the narcissist or whatever,
Right.
the dark triad that we talk about. That those are the people that are looking, it's like sharks, out, looking for blood. It's that they know how to spot that person who is empathetic or compassionate or kind. And it just is, it's quite amazing. So if you ever get the chance to read that book, it was life-changing for me because it had so many tips like that, that really I wanted to buy everybody a copy, every woman in my life a copy of it because I was like, read this book because it will change your life in so many ways. But so okay, so we want to switch gears on what your plans are, for the future and what you envision healing for, you talked about maybe doing a retreat center or like a sanctuary with, animals and stuff like that. Can you talk about what you
Yeah.
know, your goal
My
is there?
as a child going through narcissistic and sexual abuse, my therapy was animals. I had a horse. I was able to go and ride in the woods for hours at a time. That was the most healing thing to me. So animals were a big part of my healing process as a kid. And I want to create a farm where people and animals can heal together. Because what I find is people that are going through this are so beaten down, so confused. Sometimes their finances are controlled by the narcissistic person. They don't have a lot of resources, or even if they do, they can't get themselves kind of unraveled from it. So having a place where they can go debrief, get some counseling, get some peace, not have that infiltrating them, and kind of get a restart or a reset. Because I see a lot of times in these cases, the abuse victim walks away from that marriage with less of an income, sometimes they're even abused in the court system, and they have very little to live on. And the abuser walks away and just picks the next target, and there's no consequences whatsoever. And I think it's got to change. It has to.
Yeah.
Because
We see
it's
that.
just it's epidemic what I see people coming out of, and it's so unfair.
It is, and used to be, when I started hearing the word narcissist, oh, it's rare. No, it isn't.
No, and can we
It
talk
is so
about the
prevalent.
spectrum?
It's not rare, and maybe it's rare because people didn't talk about it. That's why this is so important. You know, this platform is so important in the work everyone, you know, is doing, is because it's not rare. It's something that people are living with and they don't know how to get out of it. And therefore you have kids that are getting wrapped up in it, growing up in it, and then it's just like a crazy cycle of abuse.
Well, and the one we used to think it's 1% have narcissistic personality. Well, that's who goes into therapy and actually gets diagnosed, which are very few. So the spectrum goes from some tendency, some empathy, NPD malignant, then there's sociopathy and psychopathology or psychopath. So that big long spectrum, we're guesstimating 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 is on that spectrum.
Yeah.
And they do all the DV and all the SA, all of it. And
Yeah.
that's interpersonal research, which showed, like, I took an interpersonal research violence class, and the research shows that that blew my mind. Everyone, not some, not a few, all are on that spectrum. And that was very an aha moment for me, how this all intersects.
Yeah.
Wow.
Wow. Well, we're coming close on our time, and I want to be respectful of your time today. If there was something you just want people to know, what would that be from your work that you're doing, what you've learned, what you've experienced? Is there a piece of advice or a word of encouragement that you could give someone that you want to leave here today, leave them with?
Yes, nobody has to suffer under abuse. There is always a way out. There is always a way to get a plan. It's never too late. You're never too old. It doesn't matter what your situation, sexuality, race, finances, nothing matters. There is always a way out. So don't feel like there is no hope, because there is always hope. And I set my practice up so that people have support. We have daily support groups. We have biweekly therapy groups. We have individual. We do everything so people can get support no matter what, even if they can't afford it.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Thank you so much, Linda, for all the amazing work that you're doing. And I'm so sorry for your pain and what you've been through in your life. But it's just such a testament to your strength to be able to turn your pain into purpose. And I think that's pretty amazing. You're a warrior for that. And I'm so grateful for you taking the time out today to be on our show. And we're making a little small, stamp in our corner of the world, but we're so grateful that you're here today. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. And I want people to know that they can turn their pain into purpose. No pain is wasted. And God's got their back. A lot of people have religious trauma in this, and I did for a long time. So I just want people to know, like, I'm on all the social media platforms. They can find me on any of them. And there's always hope. There's
And we
always
will
hope.
be, yeah, thank you for that. We will be putting your information out there. So for all of you listening today, we're so thankful to have Linda with us today. You can always reach out to her. You can reach out to us. We can make a connection. That's what we're here for. And it is about turning pain into purpose, because that's when the most impactful work happens, is when someone has an experience and then they've put everything they have into that to take that to someone else and help them heal. So thank you for being here today, Linda.
Thank you guys for what you do too.
Yeah, thank you. And again, Stronger Roots is a nonprofit, and we are here to provide a platform for healing and advocacy, and to bring awareness so that we can start to right a lot of these wrongs that have become habitual in our courts and everything that falls through with that. So thank you so much for being here, and we'll talk soon. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you,
Anytime you
Linda.
need.